current financial year, 2021-22, was supposed to mark a sharp recovery for the economy. Everyone expected the economy to grow at double-digit rates, low double-digit rates, but still double-digit rates. The number that was put forth by most people was 11.5%. And it was going to be, at least in terms of the numbers, one of those really rapid recoveries from what was a very bad year. Because 2020-21 was a year that saw India take the brunt of the first wave. There was a 68-day hard lockdown. Many businesses took a long time to recover. But by the second half of the year, pent-up demand had sort of kicked in. The festive season was not bad. By the end of the year, which was December, and by the beginning of this year, January, the COVID numbers were looking low. By February, we were doing less than 10,000 new cases a day. And so everyone expected that 2021-22 would be the year of the great bounce back for the economy. It can still be that. But it's just that at this point in time, it doesn't look as if it's going to happen in the first 6 months. And the reason for that is the second wave. Let's go back a little bit and see what happened. One of the firms that's been tracking business activity through this pandemic is Nomura. And they've come out with this Nomura India Business Resumption Index, which basically takes 100, which is the base level, as the level of activity before the pandemic. And then it sees what happened. Now, during the hard lockdown last year, of course, there was almost no business activity, so this plunged to the 40s. But by February this year, it had come back to almost 100. It was 99 point something. And things were really looking good. Mobility had increased, and mobility is tracked by Google in terms of how people are moving about business establishments, retail establishments, offices. And clearly there had been a dip in residential movement. Google also tracks people moving around their homes because most people had stopped working from home. A lot of people had started going back to office. People were obviously going to malls and even the cinemas were open in many parts of the country after the first wave ended. And so the business activity had almost come back to normal. But since the beginning of the second wave, the Nomura India Business Resumption Index has gone down. It's now 61 point something. Will probably go down even further. These are levels that were seen last June. Now in June last year, the lockdown was over, but many of the restrictions were still in place. People were still getting used to living with the pandemic. Businesses were scrambling to get their supply chains that had been disrupted by a lockdown back in shape and back in place. And as a result, last year in June, the business activity was just around 60. And this year, at this point in time, it's at the same level. So we've really lost a lot of momentum. It's beginning to reflect in some revaluation or reassessment of what the GDP could be this year. Initially, everyone expected 11.5%. There were some ambitious people who expected in excess of 12.5%. But now, if you look at it, everyone has come down, and increasingly, many of the consensus estimates or many of the estimates are in the high single digits. They are no longer in the double digits. So, for instance, Standard & Poor's expects the Indian economy to grow at 9.8% this year. Moody's expects it to grow at 9.3%. Nomura is a bit more optimistic, and we will come to this in a bit. Nomura believes that the economy will still grow at 10.8% this year. The reason Nomura is optimistic is because it believes that the second wave is much more of a humanitarian and a health crisis and a much less of an economic crisis. Is there merit in this argument? There probably is. And the reason is, last year, during the lockdown, business activity came to a standstill because of the kind of restrictions that were in place. The impact that this had on livelihoods and the economy shrank by almost a quarter in the first quarter of last year, which saw 2 months of the lockdown, April and May. So April, May, June, April and May were completely locked down and the economy shrank by 25%. Perhaps spooked by that, the union government has steered clear of lockdowns this time. Many of the state governments that have put in place localized lockdowns have still allowed businesses to function, economic activity to continue. There are still a lot of non-essential retail shops that have to be shut, but most of the other business activity continues in some form or the other. Sure, the medium and small scale enterprise, medium and small enterprises sector, the MSMEs, they've been hit badly, but that they've been hit badly by a variety of other reasons, including the lack of working capital. But many of the other businesses continue. So I think there is probably a little bit of merit in Nomura's argument that this second wave is much more of a humanitarian crisis than an economic crisis. It's an argument which the Reserve Bank of India also made recently, in the course of this week, when it said that it does not expect a huge impact. It does expect a marginal impact, but then of course, the Reserve Bank of India was also candid enough and honest enough to say that this was a tentative assessment. What do I believe? I think the impact will probably be a little more than what Nomura and the Reserve Bank of India expect. And the reason is sentiment has taken a beating. Businesses are reeling with the fact that many of their people have been affected. Most middle-class families, most upper middle-class families in the cities have been affected in some way. It's either a relative who's passed away because of the illness, it's a friend or who's shockingly been taken away. It's the fact that a lot of their savings have gone on medical expenditure. And I think this is going to take some time to sort of become all right, to sort of return to normal. As a result, individual sentiment, consumer sentiment, business sentiment are much lower than what one would like them to be at this point in time. Can things change? And how can things become better? Things will definitely change. You know how things are. Human memory is short. As the vaccine drive gathers momentum, as more people are vaccinated, there will obviously be a return in confidence. We've all seen these photographs that are coming out of New York, people out there in numbers without masks in Central Park. I'm not so sure that's a great thing, but they're out there. Retail establishments, pubs, restaurants, all of them doing well. I think we'll get back there once enough people have been vaccinated. It's interesting that this is happening because if you go back in history and you look at what happened after the Spanish influenza, the roaring 20s happened, right? I mean, the big boom. And of course, a lot of that boom was fueled by debt. So you had the bust, which was the Great Depression that came soon after that. And this is a bad time to be speaking of bust, so I'm not going to speak about that. But I think we could see a little bit of that bounce, but not before the second half of this year. What can help? The one thing that can obviously help at this point in time is a second stimulus or relief package. Unlike the first stimulus package that India announced, I would like this to have much more of cash components, much more of fiscal components, something that directly benefits people, not just in terms of taking care of the basic needs of people, but also in some ways making people, or at least beginning the process of healing, making them feel a little better, giving them some SOPs, giving businesses some incentives. So it will be prudent of the government to launch a scheme like that, because I really think that at this point in time, we do need some boost, some stimulus to sort of get the economy back in shape. Because this quarter, if you were to look at all the previous assessments, which are now being reviewed, obviously, but this quarter, even by the Reserve Bank of India's estimate, we were supposed to grow by around 25%. Now, this is a year-on-year growth. Last year we shrank, but this year we would have grown. It's more, the number is high because of the base effect. But we're going to be growing at nowhere that level in the first quarter simply because of the localized lockdowns. The number of deaths we've seen in May, I've written about this in the paper. The number of deaths that India saw in May is probably the highest number of deaths that any country has seen in a single month. Not surprising at all, given the volume of cases that we saw. I don't think any country has seen that volume of cases in a particular month. And May, it was an extremely cruel month. May, unfortunately, falls right in the middle of the quarter. So much of April went because of this. May is gone. June, you're beginning to see, or you will begin to see some amount of relief. You're already beginning to see the second wave numbers starting to ebb. So the first quarter is not going to be as good as people expected. So if the government wants to launch, and I think it should, a stimulus package, announce some fiscal measures, announce something that makes people feel better, this is probably the time to do it. The US has done several, right? I mean, including checks in the mail. It skewed the labor market, but that's another issue. But I think at this point in time, everyone needs that little pick-me-up. The government is probably the only organization, the only entity that can give that pick-me-up. It's a good time to do that. If we do that, if the pandemic doesn't return, and I know these are a lot of waves, if our vaccine drive gathers momentum, because it started off and then it's been faltering. There's a supply issue. We've spoken about this previously. The supply issue is likely to last for another month, I would think. But the numbers will obviously increase after that in terms of availability of vaccine. So if the vaccine drive gathers momentum, we could well either avoid a third wave or lessen the kind of trajectory that, or crush the kind of trajectory that the third wave has, which would be good for the economy. So I think the second half of this year, second half of 2021, 2022 is probably when the economy is really going to see that bounce back that people expected it to see starting from the first half itself. And we should all hope for that.